Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Free Assange Online Vigil Series. I'm Taylor Hudak, and today, to discuss with me the escalating tensions between Iran and the United States is a very special guest, Patrick Henningsen. Patrick is a writer and the founder of 21st Century Wire, and he is also a global affairs commentator. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
I'm very good. Great to be with you, Taylor.
Absolutely. So for the viewers out there, can you provide just some basic backstory that can kind of explain where the tensions between Iran and the United States are stemming from?
Well, that's a deep question. Uh, I'll give you the brief. I'll give you the brief history, and then we'll move quickly fast forward until Christmas of 2019, which is where the current round of escalation really kicked off. But the tensions between the United States and Iran have been on and off really since the early 1950s. After World War II, and the United States government, along with the British, helped to overthrow the government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. That largely had to do with the control of the country's oil, but also to thwart what they thought was the threat of a communist government or Soviet influence, with the left-wing socialist parties as well that were gaining traction, let's say, in Iran. But largely because of oil, the U.S. installed a monarch, effectively the Shah, who stayed in power and reigned until 1979. And then came the Islamic Revolution of 1979, 1980. And that's when relations between Iran and the United States really went, let's say, toxic. At that point, it became a flashpoint constantly for U.S. It saw Iran as a potential obstacle for what it wanted to do in the Middle East, but also the U.S. also became very tight with Israel at the same time, was growing closer to the Israeli state at the time. So all of these things, the combination of these things, is where we're at. The tension between the United States and Iran and Israel. It's really a three-way conversation. It's not just Iran and the United States. It's Israel, the United States, and Iran. You have to talk about these things, and actually Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as well, as a sort of distant fourth in this confab that we have. So the tensions between the United States and Iran also developed a different aspect, which is a nuclear aspect. And the U.S. has been really trying very hard to frame Iran as a potential nuclear threat. So has Israel. And according to the U.S. best intelligence estimates, Iran was trying to acquire a nuclear weapon up until 2003. That's not proven, actually, but this is what our intelligence community maintain. Actually, there's a good book called Manufactured Crisis. This is by a journalist named Gareth Porter, an American journalist. Very good book. And I think if you read that, you'll be able to see through. People can see through all the intelligent fog that's around Iran. There's so many different reports and theories and conjectures and assertions. What's the truth of it, really? I think Porter got very close to what the truth is, and the truth is that it's unlikely that Iran was ever really seriously pursuing a nuclear weapons program. But the U.S. has had to frame Iran as a potential nuclear threat. It's absolutely essential. There's a couple of different reasons for that, but according to Porter and others, the main reason is to thwart Iran's civilian nuclear power program, first and foremost. The first nuclear reactor that Iran ever got was given to it by the United States, actually. It is in the basement of Tehran University. I think they acquired that, I might be wrong, but in the early 1970s. So this reactor has actually been quite profitable for Iran. They also made quite a good business in the medical isotope business. They took over from Canada when Canada's program went offline for quite a few years. It's very, very lucrative financially. So there's financial incentives, but more than that, it's energy independence. It means that if Iran has a good civilian nuclear power program, it can do two things. It can weather the storm in terms of an embargo on oil sales. It can provide electricity and power and so forth. It can also export electricity to its neighbors, namely Iraq, for instance. And Iraq does, and they do trade in energy, those two countries, those two neighboring countries. So from the US point of view, being able to isolate Iran means they also have to stop its ability to produce its own energy independently. Otherwise, you have no leverage. You have leverage over it, but not as much as if you have total, you shut down their domestic nuclear power program. And so Israel has capitalized on this talking point, and this really culminated in a big presentation by Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2018. I think it was in the spring. It was like a real PowerPoint theater presentation. They had these secret files that Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And very soon after that, that was really theatrics. In May 2018, the United States tore up, let's say, the JCPOA, Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan. That's really a multilateral international agreement that took years to put together. That was one of the best things probably that the Obama administration managed to accomplish, of not a great Middle Eastern record for the Obama administration, but that was particularly good. But the Trump administration, it was on the cards that they were going to withdraw from that unilaterally because Israel had been demanding this for the longest time. And Trump rode into office with very strong support from the Israeli lobby and from Israel itself. So that was, top of the list was to get out of that deal and then put pressure on the European signatories with economic sanctions and secondary sanctions. Russia is already under sanctions, so that's sort of a separate. It doesn't affect the U.S.'s calculus on that, but the European partners, in the P5+1, the EU, France, and the UK, they are important. So that pressure meant that sanctions went back on Iran, and the tension built. So the tension was released with the JCPOA in 2015. And for 2 years, there seemed to be, pretty good lowering of hostilities. But from an Israeli point of view, they saw Iran as making strides during that point, helping Syria to fight off their opponents in the Syrian war. Iran's Quds Force, which was commanded by General Qasem Soleimani, was pivotal in the defeat of ISIS and pushing back some of the Al-Qaeda factions in Syria. And they did the same thing in Iraq as well with ISIS. And also Iran's Quds forces helped and aided Hezbollah in Lebanon against Israel in 2006, where they defeated Israel, pushed them out of South Lebanon. So from an Israeli-US point of view, Iran being able to operate outside of its borders to assist Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, or to assist the People's Mobilization Units in Iraq who were fighting ISIS, or the Syrian army, or the Russian forces in Syria and so forth. So this is a bit of a problem for the United States. Obviously, it's like having U.S. Special Forces or the British SAS. It's the equivalent, the Quds forces. So this is why Qasem Soleimani was public enemy number one. So a lot of this talk about Iran's nuclear ambitions, and they're going to get a bomb and a mushroom cloud. A lot of this is rhetoric. A lot of this is hot air that's constantly being drummed up in Washington and also in Tel Aviv to do two things: to distract from Israel's nuclear weapons program, which is undeclared, but also to mask what the U.S., Israel, the Gulf states as well, and Yemen, what they are all colluding to try to do in the region to subdue the Arab nationalist states, and also any perceived enemies, or to maintain sectarian divides with Sunni and Shiite, for instance. This has been a really important part of the U.S. program since the Iraq War, especially, is dividing. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. And we also have learned that the United States received intelligence from Israel, and that prompted these actions to be taken place and for the United States to choose to assassinate Soleimani. And I find that to be very problematic. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So the current round of hostilities, so I just gave a backstory. The current round of hostilities began on December 27th, right after Christmas. And what happened was there was a missile attack, a rocket attack, let's say, on the K-1 base in Kirkuk. This was a joint U.S.-Iraqi facility. Okay, so they don't know exactly. They claim they know where this rocket attack came and killed one U.S. Defense contractor, not even a member of the military, by the way, and injured others, and possibly killed Iraqi soldiers, but they don't get mentioned very much. But so, according to U.S. intelligence that it says it has about who was responsible for that, they launched a retaliatory strike against Iraq's PMUs, People's Mobilization Units, bases along the border of Iraq and Syria on the 29th, 2 days later. Mark Esper, the defense secretary, said to the Iraqi prime minister, we're going to basically hit these bases, and I'm telling you, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, because we think that Khatib Hezbollah is the name of one of the People's Mobilization Units. The PMUs are the national militia of Iraq. They were formed in 2014 to fight ISIS. There's 120,000 plus nationwide, and they're all different smaller groups that come together under one banner. They're actually part of the Iraqi military. They're not Iranian. They are majority probably Shiite, but that reflects the demographics of Iraq. There's Christian PMUs. There's Sunni PMUs. I met the commanders of both when I was in Iraq in 2017. So they, and Yazidis as well. And so there's different factions of the PMUs. The U.S. wants to frame it completely as an Israel-Iranian militias, and so they were attacked by Iran, according to the U.S., on December 27th, and they retaliated, hitting these various bases. And so the question of intelligence, where did this intelligence come from that Iranian militias, or PMUs even, hit this U.S. K-1 base on the 27th? More than likely, this intelligence probably came from Israel. Okay, now the retaliatory strikes are hitting the very same targets that reports specify that Israel and Saudi Arabia hit in late September in PMU bases on the border of Iraq and Syria. So there's some coordination there between Washington and Tel Aviv. That seems to be obvious. It's almost like Saudi and Israel did a dry run in late September. So this was already on the cards. The United States has been talking. They want to disband the PMUs. They've been talking about this now for 3 years. Okay, so this provided the pretext that you have ISIS operating in the area, who could have fired that rocket on the U.S. base. It could have been any number of free agents, let's say, or terrorist groups, or who knows. It could have been a false flag, for all we know. Iraq maintains that it wasn't the PMUs. I tend to trust the Iraqi government maybe a bit more than I do Washington these days. So, and what's interesting is the U.S. contractor that was killed, they didn't release the name. There wasn't a big fanfare behind this person, which is really interesting. And if you're about to launch a war, potentially a major war, on the back of a martyr, a U.S. serviceman, or a contractor, you'd expect that name to go public at some point. And the question is, why did the Trump administration not publicize it? Why did they not make it public? Well, it turns out, we'll just say The reaction from the U.S. strike on those PMU bases on the 29th of December caused protesters from the PMU's friends, family, fellow militia siege the U.S. embassy on December 30th in the Green Zone in Iraq. That's never been done before. During the whole occupation, they never had throng of a few thousand people sieging their embassy in the Green Zone. It's a massive fortress. It's the biggest embassy in the world, most expensive embassy in the world. I think it goes down at least 6 or 7 levels underground as well. It's a huge compound. Okay, so that sent shockwaves through Washington to watch those scenes on TV. And of course, they blamed Iran. They blamed Soleimani for personally organizing the protests. Everyone knows how popular the PMUs are in Iraq. And if the US hit 5 PMU bases on a questionable pretext, it's no surprise that they'd be coming out in big numbers to protest the US at that point. So, and the Iraqi soldiers who maintain the perimeter of the Green Zone were more than likely sympathetic to the PMUs and let them go through, where they wouldn't let the student protesters go into that area a few months before. So that doesn't surprise me either. Okay, even though some people are making it into an Iranian conspiracy, I don't think it had anything to do with that. So, so then the U.S. was the response from the U.S. to the embassy being sieged on the outer perimeter. They didn't get to the inside of the embassy, just the outer perimeter. They did a bit of damage and scared the 100 or so Marines who were tasked with guarding that facility. And the U.S. then did a double drone assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani on January 3rd. But more importantly, and not getting much fanfare, was the other military figure who was killed, who's Abu Mahdi al-Muhandes, effectively the commander of the PMUs. You have to understand the PMUs, if America had a national militia that defeated ISIS on their home turf, how popular that militia would be in those years after, and how popular the commander of that militia would be, and how important of a figure, a national figure that would be. That's who the U.S. killed in Iraq. So they made a lot of enemies at that point, not just Soleimani, who was Iranian Quds Force, but al-Muhandes, arguably a more stronger symbolic target that's not been given a lot of attention. So so that's what happened. And so the intelligence from that, Israel, as you pointed out, provided the location data, I think, or at least the visual human intelligence for the spotting on that. But to do that kind of a strike on individuals, more than likely they would have been shadowed for days, if not weeks, and there would have been technical dry runs. They wouldn't have just picked them up. There's a lot of things that could go wrong. So the likelihood is that this was planned. To me, it seems, and others, that was planned well in advance. These series of events were choreographed. Maybe not exactly. There were a few surprises, I'm sure, but the United States fully intended to kill these figures, probably coordinating with Israel as well. And so the problem is with intelligence in Washington is the intelligence community, the media, Fox News, CNN, they're all telling each other that Soleimani was a terrorist. So you keep hearing this point repeated. Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terror. General Soleimani is a bloodthirsty terrorist.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Of course, it appears as if, well, it doesn't appear, it's very obvious that the corporate media has been very effective in spewing out propaganda and instilling these ideas in the American people that Soleimani was a terrorist, that Iran is the #1 sponsor of terror, and that perhaps our national security could have been at risk here. These are all sort of CIA or intelligence talking points, in my opinion. How dangerous is it that the corporate media fails to question the validity of these talking points?
What's even more dangerous or more shocking is that the people in the intelligence community, in the CIA analysts, if there's any left, um, they do know that that's not true. But these are talking points coming out of the State Department. They're coming out of the White House. They're repeated ad nauseum on U.S. mainstream media. But people in the intelligence community are just kind of keeping stum and silent, not really coming out and saying that maybe it's not their place to come out and correct the record on that, because their job is really to facilitate U.S. foreign policy, whatever that is. And if that's to contain and isolate Iran, then they'll let these lies drift and continue out in the public sphere, because most people in America are none the wiser as to the facts of that particular story. So, after the double assassination of Soleimani and Mohandes on January 7th, then the U.S. releases the name of this defense contractor. And lo and behold, his name is Narwas Hamid, a 33-year-old Iraqi, recently naturalized U.S. citizen, was given citizenship for being a translator for the U.S. military and for the CIA, possibly. So, and he's a Muslim. So that doesn't play well with Trump's base. Imagine launching World War III, getting everyone to rally behind the flag, because of a recently naturalized U.S. subcontractor who's an Iraqi Muslim. It doesn't play that well in the narrative. And I think that's why they sat on it for 11 or 12 days. And they did, because if they came right out with that, that would have scrambled the brain of Trump's base. Probably they wouldn't be able to handle that, because there's a real anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim fervor that runs through a lot of the support base. Unfortunately, this is a fact. So they kept it quiet, and they just quietly drifted it out via the Wall Street Journal on January 7th. Then Iran responded on the 8th, and Iran responded, and I think surprised the United States. They gave advance warning through two intermediaries. So the U.S. knew an attack was coming. They hit the Ain Assad U.S. base in Anbar, which is in western Iraq. They do drone relays from that base. Okay, that's really important. Okay, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other target was in Erbil. That's Iraqi Kurdistan. That's a hugely symbolic target, because Iraqi Kurdistan is the U.S.'s nation-building project from 1991. And the U.S. have a lot of their assets positioned in Erbil, outside of Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, a state within a state that hasn't been given independence. But the United States is basically propping it up. By hitting that, Iran sent a message to the KRG, Kurdish Regional Government, and to Washington that you're not 100% safe in Iraqi Kurdistan. And that sent shockwaves through I think the leadership, the KRG leadership, to realize that, wow, this is serious. And so in the meantime, the Iraqi government had made a motion in parliament for the United States and all foreign troops, in fact, to leave the country. They saw the events of the previous weeks as a total abrogation of their status of forces agreement that the U.S. had with Iraq. So, all bets are off at that point. The relationship has really gone downhill. But if Iran had intelligence that there was a drone a handshake operation in that base in Iraq, the U.S. would control the drones from Stuttgart, Germany, but there will be CENTCOM in Qatar, the base in Iraq. The satellite positions means that for any one drone mission, you might have multiple teams working on that. So so you have multiple teams working on any of those operations. So if they had intelligence that was one of the bases that was involved in the Soleimani Mohandes strike, that's a powerful thing. And normally drone operators are not in the firing line. but in this case, they would be. So that's a powerful statement, and the accuracy of Iran's missiles strikes were incredibly accurate, and it means that they have certain guidance capabilities that maybe not the United States understood that Iran had. That's the real threat that Iran poses to the U.S. is not in any nuclear program. It's conventional missiles. This is why the Trump administration wants to dump the JCPOA. They want to put a new deal to wrap the intermediate range missiles of Iran and throw China in that deal as well and make it a global thing. It's not going to happen because Iran's not going to come back to the negotiation table. They've said they're not going to. I take their word for it. And if you study game theory of every single sanctions situation of the last 60 years, no party will ever come back to the negotiation table if there's been a threat of physical force, because the psychology is in game theory that if somebody's already threatened you with physical force or actually done something to you unprovoked, then you've got nothing to lose. Why would you comply with anything anyone asks you if they're just going to hammer you afterwards? So this is basic theory, negotiations theory. So the United States either does or doesn't know that. It's hard to tell. But let's say they don't. Let's say they do know that, and they think that they're going to redo this deal with or without Iran. So how would they enforce a new missile deal, a new nuclear deal with intermediate range missiles thrown in? They're going to do it unilaterally and by using sanctions against their allies. And so anybody who won't comply in Iran will just be under a sanctions and embargo for the next many years, and they'll continue this economic siege on Iran. So that's the real threat, because when Iran can hit everything within a certain radius, that means all of the U.S. bases are vulnerable, and the allies of the countries hosting U.S. bases, like the Gulf states, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Israel is also vulnerable. It also means that Hezbollah and Iran could wreak havoc in Israel if it escalated. And many people believe that this did not escalate after January 8th because Israel realized that it would not be able to end this and is not prepared to fight and take casualties.
And Iran is surrounded by U.S. military bases, correct?
Yeah, it is. It is pretty much Afghanistan, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, CENTCOM. Although they've left the base in Qatar part time. Now they run out of South Carolina. A lot of the CENTCOM operations that was before Christmas. So that move as well was in the fall, and that's another indication that the U.S. is planning something in December. And so if you look back and you backtrack and you look at you can see that there's something going on. The United States was definitely planned this. I think this was a planned provocation, but they didn't realize how it was going to go and might have been surprised by Iran's response.
I think they were quite measured in their response. I feel that they could have acted more aggressively.
They could have, but I wasn't surprised what Iran did, because if you look at their behavior with the U.S. Global Hawk drone they shot down when it invaded Iranian airspace in the Persian Gulf. This is over I think August in the summer, and this was around the tanker wars when you had the tanker altercations going back and forth between Iran, the British, and the U.S. and the Saudi and different flagged tankers. Iran's been very predictable as an international actor in its words and its actions. It's been very predictable. Their operations in Syria are completely known. They're invited by the Syrian government. Everybody knows what they're doing there. Everybody but Washington, for some reason, or people in Washington don't know. So they've been very predictable. Russia as well is very predictable. So this is what you would call a normative in international relations. Normative relations, or normative power. Normative power is like sort of solid, dependable, and rational. Likewise, North Korea is of recent very rational in comparison to the words and the record of, let's say, the US in these negotiations. So now the US is the irrational rogue actor. Israel is the irrational rogue actor, hitting Syria hundreds, umpteen times with airstrikes violating Lebanese airspace, etc. So now you have the international community looking at this and they're saying, Iran's a normative power now. They do what they say they're going to do. They're predictable. We can deal with them. Russia is fairly normative, predictable, no big surprises. They're doing what they say they're going to do. They're doing it within international law in Syria. The United States is not. They're occupying oil fields in Syria and openly boasting about how they're stealing the oil. So it's, I mean, this isn't a great time in U.S. history.
Now, you say it was in one of your interviews, you said that this was an indicator of the decline of the U.S. empire, which I found to be a very powerful statement. Can you describe in greater depth what that means?
Well, if you look at empires and how they behave, and there's some people who've done various studies on this. There's many books about this, but one of the I'll just pick out a couple of things that empires in decline tend to do. One of them is rather than just sanctioning their enemies, they begin to sanction their allies. So we're seeing this now with the United States sanctioning pretty much everybody because they're sanctioning their allies to say don't trade with our enemies. Basically, those are secondary sanctions. So that's one point of an empire in decline. It's losing control of its sphere of influence. That's one thing. So the other thing that they're doing is they're using force for force's sake to enforce maybe their status, or nakedly trying to openly control markets, for instance. Whereas before this was done through diplomacy and it was done through multilateral institutions. The U.S. might be screwing a lot of countries, but at least it's doing it under the radar and behind the curtain. And so there's a certain amount of face saving that's involved there. But when the U.S. doesn't give its opponents the ability to save face, then they're attacking the dignity of those countries openly, and even the ones that are friendly to the U.S. So then the United States then loses its status as a honest broker, and the real power in the U.S. Globally, I believe, besides the military power, besides the dollar power, is the perception of the United States as an honest broker to mediate in global affairs. U.S. hosts the United Nations for that very reason, because after the Second World War, it was perceived globally as an honest broker that could lead the post-World War II world order. That's not the case anymore. The United States is attacking the United Nations. It's undermining it. It's threatened to pull funding from the UN, defunding all of its programs if it doesn't do what it likes, or if it votes in favor of Palestine, for instance, on any motions on the floor. Nikki Haley, the last UN ambassador, threatened to no end to pull funding, and I think they did pull funding from various programs. Even UNESCO might have been the target of that. So that's the behavior of empire in decline, 100%. So it's no longer trust. It's all it has is the size of its stick and its ability to intimidate weaker parties. So that's pure realism in terms of international relations. So we dispense with the liberal internationalist way of managing global affairs that was dominant after the Second World War. Now we're going into pre-World War II or World War I power politics. And that's very dangerous because a small incident could easily cascade into a bigger situation. And if there's these entangled alliances like NATO or the US and Israel or etc., entangled alliances could easily pull in multiple countries into a serious conflagration. And then you're basically back to square one again. Any progress you made internationally after the Second World War goes back to zero at that point, and you have a third world war. So that's what people are afraid of.
So my friend and colleague Susie Dawson actually wrote an article titled Understanding World War III, where she describes how we may very much be involved in World War III at some point, but not fully realize it until years later. We saw this happen with World War II. Do you see us being at that point?
Yeah. I think if you were to look at it in that way, in the long scope, I would say that World War III began. World War III began in reality in probably 9/11, 2001. So that if you wanted to say when did it start, it began with 9/11, and what the United States did immediately after that was to basically attack Afghanistan, and that began a series of events leading to Iraq in 2003, leading to the occupation, leading to the militarization of the Middle East, and to where we are right now, which is right on the cusp of potential multinational war, and also a potential Saigon moment in Iraq, with the U.S. having to evacuate its forces from Iraq. And when the U.S. pulls out of Iraq, there's also the danger that they would be pulled back in by virtue of something that they themselves might do, or ISIS magically appears somewhere in the world, God forbid, on U.S. soil, and that would give the U.S. its ticket, its pretext to redeploy in the Middle East in bigger numbers and with more force than before. So this is a potential risk that a lot of people will cynically say that this is the cycle of the military industrial complex in the US, that they always need an enemy, a generational enemy to fight, so that you can maintain this system and also to keep the global footprint going. But it also seems like the US is depending also very much on some of its other partners to do the work in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia has been doing with Yemen and the UAE. They've worked hard to build up their militaries, but they're not going to fight Iran in a regional war. It's just not going to happen. Those countries haven't ever experienced war before. Iran has. During the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War, Iran and Iraq, between the two of them, lost upwards of 600,000. If you think about those numbers in comparison to, it's much more than what the US and Britain and so forth lost in the Second World War. And that was just in the 1980s. So they felt what that's like. And the Iran you see now, the modern Iranian state, with its military, with its technologies, is a response to the 1980s, to what happened to them when they were attacked by Iraq with US backing. So we created the modern Iranian state by virtue of our foreign policy, the same way that Hezbollah wouldn't exist in Lebanon if Israel didn't occupy South Lebanon for so many years during the Lebanese, quote, civil war. And so Hezbollah is a resistance force. It's a defense force. It's framed in Washington as a terrorist organization, but it's a resistance.
Can you talk about some of the myths that have been sort of perpetrated in the corporate media about Hezbollah?
Yeah, there's a lot of myths about Hamas and Hezbollah. So they become very partisan, divisive issues. So Hamas is effectively the government, and there's military and political wings in Gaza, which is part of occupied Palestine. And so Hamas gets support from Iran because it's not getting support from anywhere else. So Iran's a lifeline to a group like Hamas. Same with Hezbollah. But Hezbollah is a militia. It's an unofficial part of the Lebanese. Doesn't really have a military to speak of. They don't have an air force. I think they've got 2 planes and a couple of boats, and they have an army. They have a type of a standing army, but they do mostly security around the country. and securing roads and checkpoints and basically doing the job that police forces might do in other countries. So Hezbollah defends the front line of South Lebanon. And so they've won. They defeated Israel in 2006. They defeated them twice, actually. They pushed them out in the early 2000s. Israel was keeping a buffer zone. They're occupying part of South Lebanon. That created Hezbollah. If Israel didn't invade and occupy Lebanon, there would probably be no Hezbollah. It wouldn't exist. The same with Hamas. Israel effectively, literally created Hamas, actually. Israeli intelligence, that's on record, created Hamas in the mid-1980s to create a counterweight to the Yasser Arafat's PLO. So, and then it became something of its own organization after that. So it's very murky, actually, if you look at the history of it. But in the U.S., these are synonymous with terrorists. So there's no mention. And so because Iran funds them and supports the Palestinian independence cause and Palestinian human rights, this is framed as support for terrorism in Washington. The same with Hezbollah. Hezbollah doesn't fly around doing suicide bombs and whatever. They defend Lebanon, and they've been asked to come and help Syria in this war. And they've been very effective in fighting ISIS on the ground and Al-Qaeda. Contrast that with the Western policy in the Gulf states that are arming and supporting various Al-Qaeda factions in Syria. And arguably indirectly supporting ISIS, at least Turkey as a NATO member, 100%, has been a great lifeline to ISIS and allowing supply rat lines over the border and some might say direct support. And ISIS has a lot of U.S. gear. They've managed to acquire U.S. weapons, and there are reports, and I have seen them, and people know about them, U.S. weapons being procured from Eastern Europe by U.S. defense contractors and ending up in the hands of ISIS in Yemen and Syria. This is documented. Okay, so whether you can argue about whether that was intentional or not, or it went via Saudi Arabia, and people say no, it's not U.S. and they gave it to the Saudis, and then it disappeared and ended up in ISIS's hands. Whatever, they're getting their support from the U.S. coalition, one way or the other. And so Hezbollah is fighting these terrorists, actual terrorists, in Syria and Iraq, and in Yemen. And Iran is also, Quds Force, Soleimani was pivotal. He was getting accolades from U.S. generals in 2015 for the effectiveness that he and his forces meted out in Iraq. That's a fact, and also cooperated with the United States against Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, I believe, as well. So it's a canard, it's a complete lie that Qasem Soleimani, that the Iranian Republican Guard Corps are a terrorist organization. They've only been labeled like this to justify in a very aggressive U.S. foreign policy, and much at the behest of what Tel Aviv wanted Washington to do. And this administration is very close to Tel Aviv, closer than any other presidency in a long time.
Kushner, who is an advisor to the president, has very close ties to Israel, and I believe has a close relationship with Netanyahu, and that seems to be a conflict of interest.
It is a conflict of interest, but it does demonstrate how tight, how close this administration, Washington, is with who is in power right now in Israel. And this is a kind of a risky thing, because if you look at this peace plan that's being pushed out this week, this deal of the century that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, has been pushing, and Donald Trump has now pushed it out. Both Trump and Netanyahu are running for re-election this year. So there's definitely a political shape to this. Everybody's already agreed pretty much internationally that it's a non-starter. The deal is not the deal of the century. It's the raw deal of the century. It's already been rejected out of hand by most of the important parties. But so what is this election grandstanding? or just pandering to hardliners in the run-up to the third runoff for Netanyahu, which is in March, or Trump's reelection bid, which is next November, keeping the Israeli lobby happy, keeping the conservative right, the Christian evangelists happy. It's very important for Trump to get those votes and to secure that support, not just the support, but enthusiastically. The support for Trump has to be really enthusiastic, because it's going to be a tight race in November. No matter who runs for the Democrats, it's going to be a tight race. So Trump needs every edge he can get. And Netanyahu is pandering to a very hard right wing, ethno-nationalist wing in Israel as well. That's, even for an Israeli leader, that's unheard of. They've never gone that far to the right, not openly and not so formally. So you have these two things going on in parallel, and so you have to accept that there is a certain U.S. who is in power in the U.S. and who is in power in Israel right now are very much interlinked politically, and so this is expressing itself in the foreign policy decisions as well. That might not be good decisions, might have been politically motivated. That's very dangerous, and that should worry people, that the U.S. is making decisions internationally based on someone's political, too much. Everything's political, but really politicizing foreign policy is it's a recipe for war, basically.
So lastly, looking ahead, is this the start of the new Middle East?
Yes, that's a good question. I think there's two things that change the course of modern Middle East history. So when President Eisenhower was probably the first U.S. president that really brought the United States, the Eisenhower Doctrine, and brought the U.S. into be active and engaged, really engaged in the Middle East. From that point in the late 1950s to 2015, the United States held court. Every major decision had to go through Washington. Every major strategic had to go through Washington. Then Russia entered the Syrian war in October of 2015, and that was a game changer. This completely changed the destiny of Middle East affairs. Even Israel now has to consult and fly to Moscow to consult to see if something is okay, or if there's a problem, or something gets shot down. Now you have Russia as probably the main, tied with the U.S. really is the main broker of and in a way also as an arms supplier, as a military partner to a number of countries, potentially like Iran, like Iraq, like Syria, potentially Lebanon as well, Turkey. So that just shatters the whole status quo. Now, the second thing that happened was Iran's missile strike on January 8th of this year. That was equally a game changer. And so if there's a new Middle East, it's those two events that have shaped the new Middle East. We don't know what it's going to look like exactly, but we do know that the United States could have threatened to retaliate against Iran if they hit any U.S. facilities. And for the first time in history, the United States did not retaliate when a state actor hit a U.S. facility. Since World War II, I don't think this has ever happened. A, to get hit by a state actor, and two, B, not to retaliate. And Trump came up and said Iran has stood down afterwards, when in fact that Trump himself, the U.S. stood down. But he had to spin it. It was that desperate. He had to spin it as Iran standing down, when in fact it was the U.S. who stood down. Why? Because they wouldn't be able to finish what they would be about to start, and they wouldn't be able to protect their allies in the region, namely Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain, all vulnerable at that point. And so there, the veil has been lifted at that point. That's the apocalypse moment. Apocalypse means lifting of the veil in Latin. So that was the apocalypse moment, January 8th, when you realized who is capable of what and what the limitations of the US power in the region are. So the US has two choices: either step back and prepare a major war against Iran and try to get as many people on board as possible, or they're going to have to behave like a rational state actor and negotiate with Iran and Iraq, and allow them to negotiate with Saudi Arabia and Israel as well, included in that. So we'll see what happens, or they're just going to play a spoiler role. They'll play a spoiler role for a period of years, maybe through the duration of this administration. If he gets reelected in November, if Trump gets reelected, the U.S. will just play a spoiler role for 4 years, and then a Democrat will come in and pull the U.S. completely out of the Middle East, or get them back in. Who knows? But this has always been a problem with U.S. Foreign policy. It's one mistake and then having to make two mistakes to cover up the first mistake, and that's the story of our foreign policy since the 1950s.
Excellent insight here, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.